Every time I'm about to start a new project, I get so anxious about this. I have to make so many swatches, it's exhausting. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Your Knitting Problems Solved, a Knitting Agony Aunt series from me, Anushka of the Crimson Stitchery. I've been knitting for nearly 20 years now, and so I wanted to start this video series in order to answer the most burning knitting problems that my viewers, you guys, are currently facing. This video will be going on a new playlist called Your Knitting Problems Solved, as well as on the yarn playlist, which you can find on the playlists tab on YouTube. There are some other helpful videos up there already. As always, show notes and links can be found in the description box below. And just before I get started, I want to give a quick shout out to all of my lovely and wonderful supporters. If you enjoy my videos, please consider making a contribution to the running costs via Patreon or PayPal. Find links below. So the structure that I'm going to be following for this video series is that I will outline the question, then I will start to unravel the problem. In that section, I'll be delving a little more into the context behind the issue. After that, I will unpick the knots, where I'll try and pinpoint the exact problems that you'll be having, so that then we can make a plan of action going forwards, and I'll provide some tips and ideas for solutions in order to deal with your knitty problem. Without further ado, let's get started. The question. Ellen wrote, "I've read about this, but it's still hard to understand. I have a tight gauge and it's always so hard to match gauge with the suggested yarn weight, especially when the designer has a looser gauge, 20 stitches on fingering weight. Sometimes I have to go up so many needle sizes. In that case, should I just choose a chunkier yarn? But will the resulting fabric be too different? Every time I'm about to start a new project, I get so anxious about this. I have to make so many swatches, it's exhausting." Thank you so much for writing in this query, Ellen. It's certainly something that I've struggled with, and I can imagine that lots of other knitters have hit similar issues as well at some point on the knitting journey. So let's unravel the problem. At the core of it is the fact that different effects are created when you knit the same yarn at different tensions. What this means is that if you take one yarn and knit with it using different needle sizes, it will produce fabric that has different qualities. There isn't really a hard and fast rule around this, but there are conventions and there's also personal taste. Yarn manufacturers do typically recommend specific needle sizes to pair with each of their yarns, and it's this that contributes to the conventional recommendations. So in Ellen's question, she's asking about fingering weight yarns, and yarn manufacturers typically recommend that you should knit 4-ply or fingering weight yarn to the tension of anything from about 24 to 32 stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. The 24 stitch tension, which is at the slightly looser end, would produce a supple fabric that's suitable for sweaters and things like that, whilst the 32 stitch tension, which is towards the tighter end, will produce a much firmer and denser fabric that's suitable for things like socks. Both of these tensions are appropriate for fingering weight yarn because it's all about creating a suitable fabric for your own intended purposes. Suitable fabric, however, also comes down to personal taste. So in Ellen's example, fingering weight yarn is being knit at a 20 stitch gauge. This is even slightly looser again than what most yarn manufacturers typically recommend, and it will most likely produce a fabric that has increased drape. Ellen didn't mention the type of yarn she's using, but both the fibre content and the yarn structure, which means how it's spun and plied, will greatly impact the nature of a finished fabric. Generally speaking, yarns that have a fluffiness to them will hold up to be knitted at a looser tension because those looser fibres can expand easily. And by fluffiness, I mean yarns that are woolen spun, have a mohair or alpaca kind of fibre content, or yarns that are being marketed by knitting influencers as rustic. And if you don't know what that means, please do watch my video entitled "What is Rustic Yarn?", where I unpack that thorny issue further. In contrast, yarns that are more slick and glossy might not hold up as well to being knitted at a very loose tension. And these yarns tend to be your superwash merinos, cotton, worsted spun yarns, and any yarn that has a feeling of smoothness to its surface. When you knit these glossier yarns at a looser tension, they do tend towards making fabrics that are a bit holey and a bit flaccid, which nobody wants. Although I do strongly advise you to swatch in general and see for yourself, because when it comes to the individual yarns, there actually might be a little bit more leeway than you think before you reach the extreme, either extreme of the spectrum of tightness. So back to the problem, unpicking the knots. So Ellen's written in and she's talking about reading the pattern information at the start of the pattern, where basically a designer has recommended to use a fine yarn, a 4-ply or fingering weight yarn, but the gauge that they're asking you to make the pattern at seems much looser than the norm, right? Ellen said, when the designer has a looser gauge, 20 stitches on fingering weight, sometimes I have to go up so many needle sizes. So Ellen, this is totally the right approach. To make your tension looser, the first rule of thumb is to pick a bigger needle. I do, however, want to highlight a few more things. Firstly, sometimes you might find that a particular designer or pattern writer does just seem to have a really distinct and individualistic knitting style. Either it's really personal to them, or it just differs really significantly from your individual knitting style. This is something that you'll notice if you look at a few of their patterns and compare, and if you keep a note of whether or not you do normally tend to achieve tension with the recommended needle sizes. So in this case, it might simply be that the designer tends to knit particularly loosely, and so the gauge information on the pattern reflects this. At the same time, if you come to a realization that you tend to knit really tightly, you can see how there might end up being a really large discrepancy between the tension that the designer recommends and the tension that you're achieving, right? If you're both kind of going off towards the opposite ends of the spectrum of typical gauge that you achieve. I also want to flag up design trends in knitting, because sometimes things come up in the pattern directions that are a result of new trends that you may not be aware of, or just experimentation on the part of the designer. So it's been really, really popular for, I'd say, around the past 8 to 10 years to knit sweaters and shawls using fingering weight yarn knitted very loosely. And you especially see this technique being done using hand-dyed and especially superwash merino yarns. However, I will add that this concept has been practiced for much longer in communities and cultures that use the natural wools and those fluffier yarns, right? So we're talking about Shetland yarns and, maybe in the Nordic countries where they're using those woolen spun yarns. And that's because in these cultures, there's more use of yarn that is actually very versatile due to their composition. But as far as experimentation goes, this is just something that is quite individual, individual to the designer, but actually the individual knitter, right? Because we're making projects, for ourselves. We're not necessarily trying to hit a standard or a convention, or at least we don't necessarily need to. So for example, in the sweater that I'm wearing here, it's my Sicimbrium design. I discovered when I was swatching with the yarns that the yarn I was using created a really beautiful fabric at a range of different tensions. They were all good, just different. So while the yarn I used is being marketed and sold as a sport weight yarn, it could actually be knit at even up to an Aran weight gauge, which is 2 steps larger than normal, right? And it held up really, really well. And so I designed this sweater at the looser gauge. And if you're confused about this hierarchy of yarn weights that I've just alluded to, then please do check out the yarn weight chart on my website. You can find it at thecrimsonstitchery.com. Plan of action. So I pondered on Ellen's problem quite a bit, and I've actually come up with 5 tips. So there are 5 different ideas that I'll be sharing with you, which will help you address the solution, because as you can probably tell, it's not necessarily something that is completely straightforward. So the issue is around dealing with always seeming to have very tight tension, having to go up multiple needle sizes and trying to tackle this, and finding that this is seeming quite extreme in situations where a fine yarn is being knit at a very loose tension anyway. Tip number 1, try out knitting needles that are made from different materials and have different shaped points. So I personally find that when I knit using wooden and plastic needles, my tension just comes out slightly looser. Metal needles make me knit really tightly, especially the really slippery metal needles, the really glossy surface ones that are designed for fast knitting, and especially ones that have got really sharp points. So my go-to knitting needle brand is Higher Sharps, and has been for a long time, because the needle design, the needle materials facilitate knitting really quickly. But I did notice right from the get-go that my knitting tension tightened up noticeably. So have a little play, and as you're doing that, take measurements of your swatches, take note of how your knitting style and tension changes according to different knitting needles. Tip number 2 is to experiment with different yarn holds and knitting techniques. Experiment with your physical knitting self, including the yarn hold and knitting technique that you're using. How we feel mentally and physically has a direct impact on our knitting tension. Have you ever noticed that you were actually feeling really stressed or wound up whilst you were knitting? Maybe you were annoyed at something and you were knitting in order to take your mind off it as a distraction, or to try and calm yourself down. If you've ever done this, have you ever noticed that a few stitches or even a few rows suddenly become really tight or slightly puckered when you look at the surface of your knitting? There's a few areas that kind of jump out at you. So this can, relate to a few minutes at a time, or it can also relate to a period in your life. My advice is to try and take stock. Take stock of what's going on in your life, or what's going on around you in that moment. Are you feeling stressed? Are you rushing? Maybe you're knitting something for a deadline. Do you hate the stitch pattern that you're knitting? Or does the yarn that you're using feel really horrible or keep breaking? Or are the needles difficult to hold somehow? Become aware of this and see if you can take a breath and relax a little bit more. Take regular breaks from knitting and incorporate stretching and strengthening exercises into your daily routine, not just to your hands, but to your entire body. Obviously, you should take your own personal medical advice for this, although on YouTube, I can recommend 2 channels in particular. One's called The Knitting PT and another one is called Upright Health, and they've both got a lot of ideas for different types of stretches and strengthening exercises. Try physically relaxing your fingers, hands, your wrists, arms, your shoulders, and your neck. See if this allows you to relax your knitting tension. You can also try adjusting your seat or knitting standing up, and supporting or propping up the body of your knitting using cushions, so that the weight is being taken by a prop, not by your arms. Then when it comes to the actual knitting technique, experiment on a few swatches with different yarn and needle holding techniques. For example, you could see what happens when you switch between English and continental style knitting, throwing and picking, or just holding your loose working yarn in different ways in your hand. I do advise giving every new technique some time to adjust to, because if you're unaccustomed, obviously that's going to throw off your technique anyway. And also note that sometimes knitting and purling can also create totally different effects using different techniques. When I knit using the continental method, for example, I find that the knit and the purl the tension for the knit and the purl are quite different, so I tend to try and avoid continental purling. So this tip is centered around thinking about the tension in you, in your body, and seeing if you can do something to physically relax that, and remembering that mind and body are connected. We are our bodies, and our bodies respond to what's going on in our minds. Tip number 3 is to get more comfortable with yarn substitutions. So in this query, I'm not sure if Ellen is using the designer's recommended yarn or not. That information wasn't provided. But regardless of this, substituting yarns is a fundamental skill that I believe all knitters should continuously work on developing throughout your enjoyment of this craft. So Ellen asked, should I just choose a chunkier yarn, but will the resulting fabric be too different? What I want to note here is that choosing a chunkier yarn, so say you didn't use the fingering weight yarn to achieve the 20 stitch gauge, but instead you went for a worsted weight yarn, say. So choosing a chunkier yarn has a completely different effect. Yes, you're right. Will you be happy with this effect? I don't know, that's up to you, and that's up to whatever yarn it is that you've ended up going with. So knit a swatch, measure the tension, and take it from there. Now, if you're substituting for a different fingering weight yarn, but still having issues, it might be due to differences in the structure of your substitute yarn. This is because the substitute yarn may have a different spin, a different construction or fibre type, it might have more or less plies, or it might just be that although it is also a fingering weight yarn, so it's the same weight, it's just a tiny bit skinnier than the original somehow. These things happen. All of these variables may impact the ability of this yarn to work up at the looser gauge. But you have to bear in mind that the resulting fabric will almost always be different when you're substituting yarns, and it's just a case of achieving a fabric that you like, that you think you can work with and that you can use for this pattern. Either you can knit it as it's seen, or if the gauge is just totally different, maybe you've got to recalculate the pattern. But either way, it's a fabric that you're happy with. Now, I did say almost always because there are a few exceptions. For example, when two different yarn brands have used the same yarn wholesaler or even the same mill. This can be the case for artisanal, indie-dyed yarns, tiny little brands, but it can also be the case for larger yarn retail companies that source the raw materials, if you like the basic yarns from the same mill, and maybe they get them dyed up to different specifications, or they just stick different labels on it, right? They brand it according to their purposes. Sometimes, even if this isn't the case, even if they are two completely different yarns, you've actually just managed to source a substitute yarn that is really, really similar to the original. So you might not have any problems at all. It just depends on what it is that you're working with. So whether the issues are lying more towards your own personal knitting style, your own sort of tension issues, or if it's to do with the various variables in yarn substitutions, this takes me to my next piece of advice, which is tip 4, to keep building your knitting and yarn knowledge. So Ellen said, every time I'm about to start a new project, I get so anxious about this. I have to make so many swatches, it's exhausting. I do really sympathise with this, especially for newer knitters. There are so many different types of yarn available, and it can be really overwhelming to know how to choose between them. Sometimes it feels like all you're doing is just knitting swatch after swatch after swatch, and somehow they're all wrong. It's just not working out no matter what you try, and you just don't know what to do. This can feel really demotivating when all you wanted to do is just start the project that you've been dreaming about already, that you've been planning and that you've been imagining, and it can just feel so frustrating when the numbers just aren't adding up. So if this kind of scenario feels familiar, I suggest that you actually start to impose some boundaries around your learning. Because there are so many variables when it comes to knitting, it can really help to reduce a few of these and start to build up in-depth knowledge of yarns bit by bit. What this means is picking a type of yarn and really getting to know it first, learning how it behaves, working out what kinds of projects it's best suited for, and determining the knitting tension that you typically achieve with it. And within this process, I suggest picking smaller projects and testing out different tensions and different knitting techniques. For many, many years, I predominantly knit with the very, very common type of smooth worsted spun merino or superwash merino yarn, because it was the most readily available pure wool in the UK yarn shops in the early 2000s when I was learning to knit. I discovered that my cable projects always looked amazing in this yarn, but colour work tended to be an absolute nightmare. Later on, when I tried out woolen spun Shetland 2-ply yarns instead, colour work was immediately easier. And cables looked okay, but after a while they became a little bit indistinct and they didn't necessarily wear as well, compared to those smooth, slick worsted spun yarns where cable, it was like whatever cable I did with it, it would just pop and look incredible. After you've knit a range of different techniques, different types of objects using the same yarns, you'll find that you can almost predict how it will work up in the future. And when it comes to selecting yarns for certain projects, you'll just know whether it's likely to work or not. So that's why I advise doing smaller projects, which are less of an investment of time. And if they don't work out 100% perfect, maybe they can also potentially be a gift. You know, maybe you can rehome them to someone else that enjoys them if they're a better fit for them, or you can just unravel them and have another go. Tip number 5, related to that last point from Ellen's question, is to reframe your attitude to swatches and see them as building your own personal knitting encyclopedia. So I really do advocate reframing our attitude to swatching as knitters. This is an idea that I think can be quite divisive amongst knitters. I think either you agree with me or it's just going to be a massive eye roll. And I made a whole series about swatching addressing this exact issue a little while back. So in this case, Ellen, instead of looking at that big pile of swatches that you've made and feeling frustrated that you still haven't achieved the right tension, see that process of building that mountain of swatches as an educational experience where you've managed to spend even more time with this really, really lovely yarn that you've selected. Instead of paying to go to college, you have just given a little bit of time away and really engaged in your own learning process. Treat this as a quest to build up your personal encyclopedia and your personal yarn database. Keep records of your experiments and trials. And remember that with every swatch that you knit, even if it's swatch number 10, you're not starting fresh each time. Instead, you're building upon your previous knowledge about how that yarn works with your hands, on those needles, in that stitch pattern, how it looks and feels, and the kind of fabric that it builds up into. All of this will be contributing to something that is called tacit knowledge or implicit knowledge or embodied knowledge, which is something that I have written about in my PhD, which basically amounts to, at the moment, you're really studying and thinking about these, these knitting variables and the results that they produce, but eventually you'll have taken all of that information in and you will know, right? You'll just know when you look at a pattern, when you look at a yarn, maybe you make one unsuccessful swatch, this is like in a few years' time, you will just know what you have to do. You'll make those adjustments and maybe you'll knit one more swatch to confirm your hypothesis and you'll just get there, right? But it is a process. So with every new swatch that you toss onto Swatch Mountain, that's just another piece of knowledge gained. Bonus tip, I have one more tip for you. Just before I give my bonus tip, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who supports this channel, whether through a one-off donation or a monthly subscription over on Patreon. Your contributions help to fund this channel so that I can continue to make free, helpful videos that are available to all. If you enjoy my videos, you can support the Crimson Stitchery through Patreon or PayPal. Find the links in the description box below. Tip number 6 is our bonus tip. There's no easy way of putting this, but sometimes you just need to cut your losses. I know that it can feel really annoying when you want to make a pattern and no matter what you do, it just doesn't seem to be working out. Before you make any rash decisions, do take a little break. Yeah, take a little break before continuing to attempt to force that project to work. Take a little break, do some stretching, put the knitting in the naughty corner for a bit and just, get a fresh perspective. However, sometimes you do need to acknowledge that something just isn't quite right at this time. It can be better to just cut your losses and move on rather than spend even more time working on a project that for one reason or another just isn't working out. And at this moment in time, you cannot figure out why. Choose a different project for that yarn and make it into something else. You can return to the original project at a later date, maybe with a different yarn or with a new approach. That's the fun thing about knitting, is that we can pretty much always unravel our mistakes and start again with nothing lost and a fresh pile of yarn. So again, don't look at this as lost time, but instead a surge of growth in your own knowledge. And that brings us to the end. Have you suffered from the same tension issues as Ellen? And have you managed to find a solution? Write me a comment down below. I'd really love to have your ideas on how to deal with tension that keeps ending up being too tight, and how you deal with patterns that always seem to require a very loose gauge. If you have a knitting problem that you'd like me to help you untangle, please submit your questions through the form, which is linked in the description box below. I'll only be answering questions that are submitted through that form. If you've enjoyed this video, please do click the like button down below, and remember to subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any future videos. Happy knitting, and see you next time.